so glad to have Denise Rendina, the Vice President of Communication for the National World War I Museum in Kansas City, with us today. And she's going to be telling us all about this beautiful memorial located near downtown Kansas City. I thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us.
Well, we are so pleased that you're here to share the story of this amazing museum and memorial. It really is a treasure for all of America.
Now, when I walked through the door, well, first of all, pulling up in the parking lot is such a striking building outside, and we're going to be seeing a lot of pictures of that later on, but it was not anything like I expected. I thought it would be something a little small and maybe just a few items, but it really is a quite impressive place.
It really is. It has a lot of oomph behind it right when you pull up, and you know that you're someplace special. The tower itself is 217 feet tall, and I would love to share the history of that with you. In 1920, right after the war had ended, Kansas Cityans wanted to raise money and build a monument to honor all of those who had served in the First World War. And they did that. They raised $2.5 million in a 10-day period, which is just outstanding. Oh, yeah. And so they had a national architectural competition, and in 1921, during the site dedication, the 5 Allied leaders, including General Pershing, who was from Missouri, came here and they broke ground on this amazing site, and it was the first time in history that those 5 leaders had ever been together. Wow. Which is outstanding that it was right here in Kansas City. In 1926, the memorial was actually completed, and everything that is on the upper part of our facility, that includes this 217-foot tower that has 4 guardian spirits that look out on the 4 corners of Kansas City. They stand for courage, patriotism, sacrifice, and honor, which really encapsulates what we are trying to do here. There's also 2 sphinxes that are up there. One of the sphinxes faces towards Europe, and its eyes are covered from the horrors of war. The other faces away from Europe, and its eyes are shielded from the unknown future. You also had 2 original buildings, one that served as a community gathering place known as Memory Hall, the other that served as a relic room, and that's Exhibit Hall. And for years and years, we collected artifacts, and actually starting in 1920, even before this building was ever finished, and those were displayed in that Exhibit Hall. And the entire complex, like I said, was dedicated in 1926. And like you said, you know that when you arrive, you're in a special place because it has such grandeur. Right. One of the misconceptions is that that's the only World War I memorial in the country. We, in fact, are the only World War I museum, which is a part of the story we'll get to in a moment, but there are lots of memorials all over the country. Small towns dedicated them to the soldiers who had served from their area. We have Soldier Field in Chicago as a World War I memorial. A lot of universities have memorials, like a memorial stadium, and those often were built for World War I. But the special thing about the memorial that we're standing under right now is that it is the only one that was built to honor all of those who served in the war. When you're standing where we are right now, the tower is up above you, and down below you'll see that we have 9,000 poppies. And there are silk poppies down there that each of the 9,000 represent 1,000 soldiers who died in the war for the 9 million that were killed. Wow. Now that includes not just Americans, but all combatant countries. And that's a really important part of who we are. We don't tell just the American story. We tell the comprehensive story of the war, and we have artifacts from every country that participated. And so from the time you see the memorial until you walk underground to where this new museum is, and you see these poppies, you're walking over a glass bridge, you know that you're in some place very important. The museum itself then is built around the base of the tower, and it is a 30,000 square foot museum, which allowed us to show so many more of the artifacts that we had. And it was built by Ralph Applebaum, who is the gentleman who designed the Holocaust Museum and Clinton's Presidential Library. He's a very gifted person. And the whole purpose of the museum and the way that they approached it is to tell the story through the average person who lived the war, the nurse, the sailor, the soldier, the civilian who lived it. There are red quotes that are all throughout the gallery that you'll read that are taken from diaries and letters. You can poke your head into a trench and you're going to hear the recordings of people. There's just so many ways that you can feel the connection between an event in history that was 90 years ago and today. And so it's a really special museum. and was actually designated by Congress as the National World War I Museum. So we are the only museum in the country that tells the comprehensive story of the war. There are other museums that tell the story in part with other stories they share, but we're the only one that tells it from start to finish. And yes, this is a museum about World War I, but really what it is a museum that's taken a little 4-year slice of history that was so important to the world and to the nation that America became, and tells it through the average person, and it's really easy to relate to, and it's really easy for people to kind of feel like they understand what was happening at that time. So we're really proud of what we have to share here and are excited for people to see it.
I noticed also in looking around, it's not only about the war, but it's about the culture, because I noticed the music is playing in your cafe, the Over There Cafe, and there's music sheets and things that commemorate that whole era of American history, isn't it?
That's absolutely right, and you'll see when we go in that there's a section that's a chronology wall, and along that whole chronology wall it's a month-by-month depiction of what happened in the war, and people read that and I think they like it because it's digestible chunks, is what I call them, of information. What was going on in the war, what was escalating, what was changing. Well, if you look down below that, you're going to see little facts from culture. Who was playing in baseball right then? What movies were out? What was going on? And it kind of puts it in context of, oh, well, I've heard about that, so now I understand what was going on at that time.
Yeah, because there's no veterans anymore, is there?
Actually, we have one left who is an American. He's 109 years old. His name is Frank Buckles. He was originally from Missouri. He lives in West Virginia now, but he was able to come 2 years ago on Memorial Day and tour the museum, and it was a fantastic thing to have him here at the museum.
The last standing survivor of World War I.
That's right. There's a lot of serendipitous connections back to Missouri, that he was from there, that General Pershing is from Missouri, but this really isn't a local or a state museum. This really is a treasure for the nation, and we hope that people will take the time. Kansas City is a wonderful town with so much to offer, and this is truly one of the best gyms that we have, and we hope people will come and take advantage of it.
Now, this is not supported by federal funds either, is it?
That is correct. We raise most of our money through the gate, meaning what people pay in admissions or they spend in the store or at the cafe. We have a lot of generous donors who help us, and then we do get a small subsidy from the city of Kansas City, Missouri. And Kansas City should really be honored for what they did. Not only did they build this original memorial, but they stepped forward in a time when it needed renovation and restoration, and then built this wonderful museum to go with it. So it is really a gift that Kansas City has given to the nation that people should take advantage of.
Wow, I'm thoroughly impressed. We're going to go take a look at the museum right now and take a walk around and see some of the exhibits. We're going to go up the tower, and I've got a feeling there's a whole lot of information to learn. Don't go away. We'll be right back on the Out of the Norm show, where the stories are all about you.
When you first enter the museum, you're actually in a portion of the war where America has not entered yet, and that's a really common question, is that people will come in and say, where are the doughboys? And what we explain is that from 1914 through April of 1917, we're telling the story before America enters the war. What you're looking at here are a number of propaganda posters that were used in Europe, and there's a second half of the museum where America has entered the war, and when we look at those propaganda posters, you can really feel the difference between the ones that were used in Europe and the ones that were in America. Also here to our left, this is a really great graphic that we have that shows the intricate nature of the Great War, the number of countries that were involved, and how the chain reaction happened. How did it that so many countries became involved in the war? And so, yes, we use technology, but we also use traditional methods that museums use to tell this story.
Now, this is an interactive piece again. Is that typical throughout the whole museum? It is.
It is spread throughout the museum, and in this one, this is showing how machine guns work, and it really is an engaging way for people to view information in a new and exciting way.
Now, you're touching it every so often, and it just changes direction?
It does. It's actually with this pin right here that has a light in it, and so you're using that pin to pick which of the scenes that you want to see, and this is showing how it cools. This one shows the automatic fire in real time, and here it's showing in slow motion how the machine gun worked. And then right next to it, you have footage here that shows actual machine guns in use during the war. It's showing actual footage from the war. As I was explaining before, we have an amazing amount of technology that helps interpret the war. And this is just one example of that. This is what we call a study interactive table, and you have a laser light pen here, and propaganda posters were a huge important thing in the war. And so you pick a propaganda poster and it picks something off of there, and you're able to add it to your poster. You can shrink it, you can move it, you can make it more opaque. You add that image, and then you keep going and adding other things to your poster, and eventually when you're finished, then you come over and you can email the poster to yourself and take it home as a souvenir. It'll be waiting for you. Another great example are the rooms that are right over across from the tables, and those are called the reflection audio booths. And in there you can touch a screen and listen to poetry, prose, music, and speeches of the time. So what we find is that it's not just the kids who enjoy really understanding the technology and how it relates to World War I, but all ages seem to really enjoy this part of the museum, and it's a great way for people to learn about the war. One of the amazing things about the National World War I Museum is that it has objects from all of the countries that participated in World War I. This is a great example of that along this wall. There are uniforms from the different countries. One from Russia, you have snowshoes, you get into Irish and Australian. It really kind of shows how different cultures came together in the clothing that they wore. And over here I'd love to show you the new trenches that were built. Trench warfare is something that is always associated with World War I, and we have a very unique way of interpreting that here at the National World War I Museum. There are a series of times when you can look in and see trenches. This first one was actually modeled after a photograph that was taken outside of Berlin and truly was a piece of propaganda. What they did was built a trench outside of the city so that families could see what their boys, the soldiers who were going off to fight, were going to live in. Obviously it looks clean and pristine and nice, and as you go down the other trenches, what actually happens is that you stick your head into a hole where you're peeping in 3 different experiences and seeing how different nations use their trenches. And there are artifacts that are in there. It's the reality of what it was like to live in the trenches and the challenges that went with that. And what they also did was record the words that were the written words of soldiers, and when you pop your head in, not only are you getting the sights of what was in the trench, but you're hearing from the soldiers who lived in them, and it's a very moving experience. At the far end of this experience is a similar scape like this, except that it's at the end of the war and shows what happened when the trenches collapsed on themselves and they were in just great ruin. And so it's a very, very moving part of the museum for people to experience. This section of the museum talks about the battles that took place in the air and the sea. I think another really exciting thing to share the story of is that the fact that we're still collecting artifacts. We get calls every day from families who have one object in their family that's been there for generations, or collectors who have world-renowned collections. We're to the point that we don't take all objects because we have so many, but there are so many more objects to interpret this war, and we really welcome those kinds of donations and know that this is a wonderful place to share that family's history with the rest of the world. So as we enter this portion of the museum, now you're getting still what was happening in Europe, but you also have what was going on the home front because America has entered the war. You'll see the propaganda posters right here, and when you look at them in relation to the ones that we saw earlier, they really, in my opinion, have an American flair to them. And of course, you have the very famous poster that a lot of people think about with World War II, but in fact was used during World War I with Uncle Sam. And then one of my favorites up top has a woman in a Navy uniform and says, "Gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy." You know, during this time of this war, women still didn't have the right to vote. And a lot of people think about Rosie the Riveter and the important role that women played in World War II. And there's an equally important story about women in World War I that we're so happy to share, along with stories of African Americans, American Indians. A lot of those same stories and those threads that you know from World War II happened in World War I, and you'll discover them here at the museum. This is such an interesting object. I love to be able to point it out, and it goes along with the story that we were telling earlier that people are still donating objects to the museum. In this particular case, when people bought cigar boxes, there were pieces of fabric in the boxes of each of the flags of the countries who participated in the war. Someone then took those and quilted it into this lovely quilt, and it was in their family for generations as an heirloom, and about a year ago they stepped forward and donated it to the museum. It was made in 1915 in Springfield, Missouri, and we are so pleased to be able to share it with everyone. Many people know the story of American women and the role that they served in World War II. A lesser-known story is those who served in World War I. American women went over in large numbers, and they were telephone operators, nurses, ambulance drivers, and did a lot of other important behind-the-scenes work during World War I, and we're very proud to have a beautiful assortment of uniforms that these women wore during the war. This is one of the really exciting treasures that we have here at the National World War I Museum, and it is a Renault FT-17 tank that actually saw action on the Western Front. It was a two-man tank, and it's smaller than a lot of people think. Tanks obviously were developed during World War I, and there were some tanks that were really, really large. This is one of the smaller ones, and this is a new acquisition since the museum has opened, and it has a really amazing story behind it that I love to share with people. The doors, the way that they entered to drive this, there are two doors that are right on front of that. And when the doors are opened, there are actually names that are scratched into that. And the French drove this tank, but it was American mechanics that worked on the tank. And one of the names that's carved into the door itself, we did a little bit of research, and it was an American soldier who lived in Kansas City, just blocks from the museum. So we feel like that connection to the museum is pretty spectacular, and this is just an outstanding example of a treasure that we have here at the museum. Another real treasure of the museum is this Harley Davidson that was used in the war, and it's one of a kind, original, and has a lot of the original parts on it. It's really an outstanding thing that captures people's attention while they're here. But I think one of the things that I love is that sitting next to it is this helmet, and this helmet is one of my favorite stories. If you look, it's a helmet that obviously somebody picked up as a souvenir, and they stuck stamps to the side of it right on the helmet, and they put a tag on it and mailed it through the mail just like that, and it made it back here to the United States. And I think that there are so many little treasures like that, in addition to the great things like the Harley that people will remember. The little treasures like that if you take the time and see them, really tell the story of the Great War. Vice President of Museum Programs, whose name is Eli Paul, on Memorial Day of 2009 was on Turner Classic Movies with Robert Osborne, and he was being the expert that was looking at 5 World War I movies and talking about what was right about the movies, what wasn't historically accurate, and one of the movies that they showed was the famous movie Sgt York. Gary Cooper played in Sgt York, and when Eli returned to Kansas City to the museum, Gary Cooper's daughter, whose name is Maria Cooper Janis, phoned him and talked about how excited she was that we were keeping the memory of World War I alive and really sharing the story that her father was so passionate about. After a while, she decided to loan us her father's Oscar, which he won for Sgt York, which is temporarily on view at the museum. It will go away soon. It's been here for about a year, but it's such a fantastic piece that most people don't ever have the chance to see an Oscar. And what was really exciting about it was that Maria Cooper Janis came to the museum on Veterans Day this past year, and we found Sgt York's son, who still lives in Tennessee, and he was able to join us also. And it was the first time that the children of these two very famous people who were tied together through this incredible story had ever met, and it was a really special time here at the museum.
Like love in the South.